All right, I think we're broadcasting. So welcome everyone to Completing the Circle Towards a Circular Economy. The learning objectives for this session are shown here, and we'll be following up with a survey and with more information on how to receive credit from AIA. We'll also collect questions submitted to the Q&A box throughout the session, and if the speaker isn't able to get to your questions at the end, we'll try to answer them in writing and share them on the website after the teach-in. If you subscribe to the, if you registered for the keynote this morning, you'll get a notification when the recording is available and when any extended Q&A is published. If you just joined via the Zoom link, you can sign up at architecture2030.org/enews for our email updates. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Emily Walport. Emily is a senior materials engineer based in Arup, New York's Advanced Technology and Research Office on that team. Over the past few years, she's been committed to supporting the circular economy in the built environment, exploring the role materials in the construction industry can have in addressing the climate and environmental challenges we face, as well as in improving the spaces we live and work in. She's worked on research projects looking to define effective circular economy principles for industry as well as for international projects, helping clients to understand what a transition to the circular economy means for their business and to identify the first steps they can take to accelerate the transition. Thank you so much, Emily. I will give the screen to you.
Thank you. Share my screen. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. As Natasha said, my name is Emily Walport. I'm a senior materials engineer at Arup, based in our New York office. For those of you that don't know Arup's an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, consultants, and technical specialists working across all aspects of the built environment. As an organisation, our pioneering work first came to the world's attention with the structural design and construction of the Sydney Opera House. In the decades that have followed, we have delivered increasingly complex, demanding projects which build multi-purpose long-term value. Now, with over 14,000 people across the world, we work at the cutting edge of transformative innovations, including developing more resilient cities, smart mobility, intelligent buildings, green power, low-impact building materials, and predictive modelling. Over the past few years, I've personally been focused in my work at looking at how we can deliver a built environment that operates within our planetary boundaries using circular economy principles. At Arup, our circular economy journey formally started back in 2014 when we became an Ellen MacArthur Foundation Circular Economy 100 member. In 2016, we then became the Foundation's Built Environment Global Knowledge Partner, and since then, we've been working on several research projects with the Foundation, looking at cities, new business models, and demonstrator projects viewed from all parts of the world. In this presentation today, I'll be focusing on presenting the findings from a research project called From Principles to Practices, which is looking at just that. How can circular economy principles be translated into everyday practices in the built environment? This is one of the most recent points on our journey, and I'm excited to share an overview of the project with you today. The circular economy seeks to create environmental, social, financial, and economic value through resource strategies. It's about designing the right system conditions to maximize the exchange or circulation of all available resources to create economic activity by critically considering the stocks, flows, and feedback of resources within the economy. When considering the principles of a circular economy, while the opportunity is clear for fast-moving consumer goods, the opportunity for long-life built environment assets can be less clear. As part of our commitment to accelerating the transition of our industry to a circular economy, we've carried out research and projects, many in collaboration with other organisations, exploring the topic at all scales, from a systemic level right down to a materials scale. And on this slide here, you see a small selection of the publications we've developed. While on a construction site, watching a building come together, I still wonder how circular economy principles can be made relevant to construction and the wider built environment we know today. The principles are still far, far removed from current built environment practices. The built environment we live in today largely continues to be designed around the linear take, make, dispose model in which materials are sourced, used, and then disposed of as waste. As defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a circular approach employs three main principles: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. Applying these principles to the built environment can create a sector that is resilient to volatile prices of raw materials, that maintains essential natural ecosystem services, and that creates urban areas that are more livable, productive, and convenient. Value is created by using design, technologies, and business models to manage healthy, non-toxic materials and resources in loops that maintain them at their highest possible intrinsic value in every use. In the first phase of our Principles to Practices work, published in 2018, we established our vision for a circular built environment and identified the key barriers, opportunities, and enablers of implementing circular economy practices. We analysed over 100 circular economy case studies from around the world and conducted over 100 stakeholder interviews right across the supply chain from 5 European cities. Through this work, we identified the stakeholders best placed to lead the transition, and they were policymakers, investors, and construction clients. So why were the 3 stakeholders in particular selected? We understand that policymakers, investors, and clients are the pull stakeholders. They have the ability to influence decisions made at the start of the built environment value chain, but also influence decisions made by other stakeholders down the value chain. In essence, they have the greatest control over the business model and contractual framework in which built environment assets are created and operated in. In the next 8 slides, I will briefly present our vision for a circular built environment. A circular built environment embeds the principles of circular economy across all of its functions, establishing an urban system that is regenerative, accessible, and abundant by design. The concept of waste is eliminated and assets are kept at their highest value by integrating new business models and technologies. A circular built environment supports human well-being and natural systems. Human living standards, health and well-being are improved, and natural systems are restored. Building occupants have improved outcomes in health and productivity, and material abundance comes without environmental degradation. A circular built environment is guided by systems thinking. Decisions made across the built environment value chain are guided by feedback-rich and data-driven models that will account for interactions between buildings, infrastructure, users, and the biosphere, as well as change over time. The model considers economic, environmental, and social outcomes. A circular built environment utilizes holistic urban planning. The overall design of space supports resilient and thriving communities with new business models to stimulate growth and address congestion and pollution. Nature becomes part of urban areas, improving air quality, moderating extremes of temperature, and supporting human well-being. A circular built environment is leveraged by digital technology. Digital technologies provide accessible platforms to facilitate asset sharing and the management of buildings and materials. Smart apps and innovative practices virtualize many services currently rendered by the built environment as more people shop online and work from home. A circular built environment supports continuous material cycles. Building occupants and infrastructure operators are responsible for tracking and returning construction materials to suppliers for reuse. Use of looping, non-toxic materials reduces pollution and virgin material consumption. A circular built environment contains flexible, productive buildings. Buildings meet their own energy and water needs, whilst waste generation is dramatically reduced thanks to circular products. Internal utilization rates increase thanks to shared, flexible, and modular spaces. A circular built environment is designed for maintenance and deconstruction. Buildings are designed to enable maintenance, repair, reuse at all life cycle stages. Techniques such as modular construction minimize waste generation during construction and deconstruction stages. And last but not least, a circular built environment delivers integrated infrastructure systems. Integrated water, energy, and waste networks prioritize natural systems and could be used more intensively as smart management fastens peaks, making use of capacity available throughout the day. Focused by this vision developed in the first phase of Principles to Practices, the aim of the second phase of work was to demonstrate the value and process of implementing circular economy principles in the built environment to real estate investors and construction clients. We've targeted these stakeholders in particular since, as I mentioned, they have the greatest capacity to influence decision-making, set direction, and catalyze action throughout the supply chain through investment requirements, 10-year models, and design briefs. This second phase of work was led by Arup and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in partnership with 3XN Architects GXN Innovation and with expert advice from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and JLL. The starting point for developing any business model that is trying to create value is to understand where value is currently lost. By holding roundtables with investors and construction clients in Amsterdam, Aarhus, Berlin, London, and Milan, as well as from our own experience, we identified 5 key sources of lost value in real estate. Underutilized space. The average office is 40 to 60% unoccupied during office hours. That was, of course, before the pandemic. Buildings demolished prematurely. There's a big disconnect between the technical life that architects and engineers design buildings for compared to the economic life determined by international accounting depreciation rates or the perceived opportunity cost of an old building compared to a new building. Current buildings often focus on single uses, and therefore their skin and structure are locked into a single function. This constrains the building to respond to market changes through expensive retrofits or premature, time-consuming demolition and reconstruction. Vacant land. Significant areas of vacant land with planning permission are not being brought forward for development in anticipation of increasing land prices. Depreciated building materials. One estimate puts the current residual value of materials captured globally each year at less than 5% of the value of new manufactured products. And finally, underperforming components. Approximately 20 to 40% of building energy could be profitably conserved, with many buildings not performing as designed. Each of these sources of lost value is a business opportunity. So we've developed 5 new business models addressing each source of lost value, inspired by circular economy principles. These are flexible spaces, adaptable assets, relocatable buildings, residual value, and performance procurement, which I'll each go through in a bit more detail now. So first up is flexible spaces. In some buildings, especially offices, retail units, and higher education buildings, during core operational hours, you get parts of buildings that are occupied and others that are unoccupied. The flexible spaces model sees these vacant spaces listed on online platform for short-term use by additional tenants to increase asset utilization. The spaces can be listed in real time if a building is designed to be smart and feeds live information on space availability to the platform. This technology is already being used in buildings like the Edge building in Amsterdam, developed by OVG. Depending on the lease agreement, it could be the landlord or the anchor tenant that takes the lead in finding additional tenants. Or it could even be a third-party operator who runs their business model off a portfolio of underutilized buildings. The link to a circular economy is clear. If existing spaces are used more smartly and to their full potential using new business models, the need to build new spaces and the resource use associated with it is reduced. Key enablers include less rigid commercial lease structures that allow additional tenants and getting planning authorities to allow additional uses that might be non-compliant with the registered use of the building. Overall, this model has all the benefits of the sharing economy without the risk and volatility that some flexible space providers are currently facing. Next is adaptable assets. This model operates through a new investment partnership. You get a long-term investor to invest in the adaptable skin and structure, acting as a chassis that can accommodate multiple functions, while a short-term investor rents the chassis to adapt it for a specific use over a time horizon. If the market changes so that a change in use is required, the building can be stripped back to its chassis, with another short-term investor renting it and cost-effectively fitting the space to reposition the building on the market. This model incentivizes long life, loose fit design to keep buildings in use for as long as possible at their highest value, one of the 3 principles of a circular economy. In effect, designing for adaptability is an insurance policy against market risk. Scenario planning can be used to identify trends affecting that location to understand several possible futures. From this, the design team can create an envelope of requirements pertinent to the more rigid parts of the building, such that a design team can effectively and efficiently make passive provisions for future requirements. Moving on to relocatable buildings. The relocatable model sees an operator deploying a portfolio of temporary buildings on vacant sites to create short-term or meanwhile spaces. Relocatable buildings are modular, designed for deconstruction, and made of durable, high-quality materials that create spaces with a permanent feel. The relocatable building operator can therefore charge rents closer to that received for permanent buildings. The operator is responsible for identifying the vacant sites as well as the tenants to rent the space. When the space is no longer needed on one site, the temporary building is easily disassembled and relocated to another site and another, and so on and so forth. This model designs out waste by incentivizing prefabricated and modular construction techniques, whilst ensuring materials are kept in use for as long as possible by designing buildings for deconstruction. Municipalities have a supporting role to play by making information on unused greenfield and brownfield sites available to operators. Next up, we have the residual value model, which seeks to capture the value lost in building materials through demolition. Material depreciation in the built environment accounts for approximately 2.1 trillion euros of lost value each year. The residual value model involves the creation of a new commodity futures contract, where ownership of building materials at deconstruction are traded on a centralized exchange. So once the building is constructed, futures contracts associated with recoverable building material would be sold on the exchange by the construction client during the operational phase of the building. Buyers are expected to be anyone seeking to manage their position against increasingly volatile material prices, such as contractors, suppliers, and commodity traders. The contracts can continue to be traded while the materials are still in use, and whoever owns the contract at the time of deconstruction claims ownership of the material. The materials can then go on to other uses. An early indication that this could be viable is the success of Dutch organization Madasta. The platform uses a database of buildings information modeling to create a materials bank and uses commodity market prices to estimate the value of the materials in its database. And finally, performance procurement. Performance procurement extends the products as a service model currently seen in individual systems such as lighting, vertical transportation, and air conditioning, but to the building level. Under the performance procurement model, rather than buying products from suppliers through capital budgets, construction clients buy subscriptions for services provided those products through operational budgets. For a building, it might be that the construction client still buys the structure outright, but the skin, services, and space plan are procured through subscription contracts from service providers, with the contract stating a minimum performance. The subscription payments are linked to real-time performance, monitored potentially using sensors, and include operational and maintenance costs. As the service providers are now paid for the performance delivered, they're incentivized to put durable systems into the market, systems that can be remotely optimized and reduce any downtime, thereby reducing running costs and closing the performance gap. Beyond just defining the models and practicalities of how the models would be delivered, we've also evaluated the financial performance of each model using discounted cash flow analysis to compare the cash flows between a linear model equivalent and the circular case for each of the proposed models. The cash flows for each model are based on real-life development projects provided by investors and construction clients. These testbed projects consider different development types in 5 European cities. Whilst the 5 testbed projects were all located in Europe, we believe that the findings of this research have global applicability, and we are excited to continue working with clients and collaborators to realise the potential that the circular economy presents for our industry and their businesses. On this slide, you can see a summary taken from the report showing the calculated financial returns for each of the models. In all cases, the circular real estate business models can improve financial performance. For the flexible spaces model, when explored on a tenanted office space in Milan, the potential additional revenue was found to be equivalent to 18% of the net present lease cost over 12 years. For the adaptable assets model, when tested on a residential development in Denmark, we found an increase in internal rate of return by 3% over 50 years. For the relocatable buildings model, we found that moving a building across several sites in Amsterdam could create an internal rate of return of up to 26% over 11 years without accounting for land costs. The residual value model was tested on a retail fit-out in Berlin and was found to reduce the whole life cost ownership by over 5% over 10 years. And finally, we tested the performance procurement model for a built-to-rent development in London, and the model delivered up to a 3% improvement in internal rate of return over 30 years. The models developed deliberately challenge conventional thinking and processes, but at the same time reflect activity from leaders in the built environment industry. The readiness framework of now, new, next gives an indication of current industry maturity levels to adopt each model. For the purposes of illustration, each model here is presented in isolation. In reality, any one project could use concepts from all 5 of the models. A holistic, blended approach to circular economy principles on a project will be the most effective way of maximizing the benefits. Early stage commitment from project leaders and collaborative approach from the supply chain will be required to identify which combination of models is best suited for each project. Because the circular economy has such a clear entry point around resources, to date, the circular economy agenda for buildings has revolved around design strategies. Examples include designing in layers, designing for deconstruction, or designing for flexibility and adaptability. Now, the outcomes of a design strategy, by its very nature, is likely to be reduced resource consumption, reduced construction operational costs, and material life extension, which are all great and very much needed outcomes. What this study hopes to demonstrate to real estate investors and construction clients is that adopting circular economy business models offers a strong approach to competitive positioning in the market. Circular economy thinking offers real estate investors a framework for achieving environmental and social goals, while at the same time delivering better economic performance. By delivering more flexible, adaptable, and deconstructible buildings, investors move from making a one-time bet that's less likely to remain profitable to owning an asset with a dynamic operational model, one that offers new revenue streams over longer periods and greater residual value. By approaching it as a business strategy, circular economy gets embedded in the investment decisions, revenue models, and in all aspects of the delivery, including the design, procurement, operation, and end of service. The outcomes are now centered around value creation and drive scale up towards systemic change and the wealth of flows that we are all working towards. This work articulates how circular economy principles can be realized in practice by adopting circular business models and demonstrates that they could deliver improved financial performance. It lays out what practical changes can be made on projects to make these models everyday industry practices. It's important to remember that this is not solely about looking at dollars, but also about embracing terms such as political value, reputational value, and even happiness when contributing to safer and healthier living environments. To achieve systemic change, we need to start demonstrating what's possible. Exemplar projects are vital to accelerating the transition of our industry, helping to inspire us, as well as creating the evidence base that will be required for policy change and stakeholder buy-in. As I mentioned earlier, we're really excited to work with clients and collaborators in applying these business models and demonstrating that this potential is achievable. Both reports from Principles to Practices work are freely available online, and I would encourage you to all go read them. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this work, and I would very much welcome any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, everyone. So we're taking questions through the Q&A box, which is open. And Emily, let's start with this one. Penn Deal asks, why relocate a building instead of leaving it there? How does this reduce carbon emissions?
So I think that it's important to remember that there's no kind of one size fits all. So of course, extending the life of a building is almost in a lot of instances is going to be the lowest carbon option, and certainly that's kind of step one, I think, is the building that you've got there going to be, can you extend its use over a longer period of time? But there are instances where we build structures which we know right from the start are not going to have a very long design life, and often we do design them actually to have a much longer design life, and then they get teared down much earlier than they need to. So this is really around perhaps for certain structures which don't need to have 30-year design lives, perhaps creating a structure that can be deconstructed and moved around, and also creating a more adaptable solution potentially for an area that in a short term needs a solution but won't require it for a longer term.
Thank you. I have another question. Do you know of example policies at the city level that can incentivize or support the development of circular economies?
Yeah, I think that policy change is going to be a really important factor in driving change and incentivizing it. I think that there are good examples of where cities are starting to support change and adoption of circular economy principles, particularly there are a couple of instances within the United States, but Europe and many other countries are perhaps slightly further ahead. But for instance, there's a policy in California which looks at using cradle-to-cradle certified carpet in office spaces. Now that's at a very small scale, but these types of policies help to kind of drive change in the industry, both from kind of a designer's perspective, but also the supply chain in making sure there's that demand to drive their change as well.
Thank you. And are there other resources that you would recommend for developers to learn more about the business case for a circular economy, or to compare the value propositions for different models in a given scenario?
Yes, and I think that this is something that there's more and more evidence-based developing. As I kind of said, a lot of the work to date focused on design solutions and creating structures designed for disassembly, looking at building in layers, but more and more we're looking at the business case. So I would certainly recommend starting with our Principles to Practices publication, but the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website also has a whole host of different resources, and I could certainly share a longer list of reference material, so please feel free to follow up after.
Thank you for that. We can share resources and references on the website later when we post the extended Q&A from all of these sessions. We have a question. Is software available now that can help to use with flexible spaces to find additional short-term tenants? And is there a precedent regarding zoning restrictions on change of use and how to build buildings to accommodate change of use per building code restrictions?
Okay, there's a few different things there. I think if I start with the first one, which was around identifying spaces which are unoccupied and therefore being able to use them. I'm not aware of a kind of open source software that does this, but there are a number of different businesses and products that are doing this in different parts of the world. Again, in our Principles to Practices report, we reference a couple of different examples. And for instance, the Edge building, as I mentioned, that's done at a kind of an office scale, but there are portfolios, organizations looking at whole portfolios across cities to identify kind of spaces that people can use for, say, office meetings or other types of events. The second, Natasha, could you remind me what the second part of that question was? I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's three questions all at once, so I'm happy to tell you what they are. The question asked if there are precedents regarding zoning restrictions on change of use and how people can build buildings to accommodate change of use per building code restrictions.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm going to say that I don't have I don't think I can answer to this to the degree I'd like to. I can think of a lot of examples of places where I've lived and worked where there certainly have been quite significant transitions in, the types of spaces that are being used. So say in the financial district in New York, where our office is, there's a huge amount of commercial spaces that have transitioned to residential properties, the last decade or so. And so I think there is precedent of it being done. I think that in a lot of those instances, perhaps if you were to interrogate it, it may be that they weren't done in the most sustainable or circular way. And I think that that's where creating from the outset adaptable buildings is really important, to ensure that when you do make those changes, you can do them to create not only productive and good spaces, but also do it with a low environmental impact. So there certainly is precedent. I can't think of specific policies or kind of zoning regulations in different examples, but again, would be very happy to continue that conversation.
Thank you. Gregory asked, how did the Edge building in Amsterdam ensure their floor space, like you mentioned?
So the Edge, the way that building operates, as I understand it, is effectively depending on how, and I think this is going to be an interesting to see over the next, as people start to return to the office, whether more of these types of systems come into use. But it's about allocating space depending on who's going to be in an office on any given day and what activities they're going to be doing. So it's, I think, a really interesting example of where, there was a statistic early on that office space is often 40 to 60% unoccupied during working hours. And it's an interesting way of looking at how you can challenge that, and based on, I guess, flexible working and kind of hot desking and those types of behavior.
Thank you. I'm curious, are there any material or technological innovations that you're aware of or excited about that enable or improve the efficiency of some of these models of circular economy in the built environment?
Material or technologies. I mean, I think from a materials perspective, I'm a materials engineer, so a lot of what I do is focused on materials. I think a lot of that goes back to almost the design solution side of things, and I think that there are a lot of developments in materials, both in terms of kind of new materials, biomaterials, but also just looking at the way supply chains are structured, and energy that's used to manufacture materials and things like that. I think that there's a lot of exciting innovations and developments which will support circular economy. And I think that technology will be very important in supporting several of the business models that I presented today. I think that they're certainly, in terms of using spaces for multiple different uses. There's certainly something around understanding how spaces are being used, when they're being used, how many people are using them. And also, I think that something that's important around circular economy in the built environment is understanding assets over their life. What are they made of? How do they change over time? What is the value of those materials? So BIM and other kind of modeling technologies, I think, will be important. Digital twins, things like that, in supporting these different models.
Thank you. And do you see ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic and the response to it and shift toward working from home will play into some of these models that you discussed?
Yeah, it's something I've thought about quite a lot. I think that certainly I've really kind of reflected on the fact that so many of our spaces aren't that adaptable, whether it's our homes for accommodating us, working from home. I'm taking this call from a bedroom, or our offices, which are currently sitting entirely idle, while we all work from home, and restaurants and bars trying to work out how they can accommodate people. I think that because of the lack of adaptability, I think it has probably led to some fairly environmentally unfriendly changes, just because we've clearly had to adapt, but we haven't had, our buildings haven't enabled us to adapt in the kind of most sustainable or economically beneficial way. So I think it's certainly, to me, kind of reinforced the need for adopting some of these principles. And I think that, again, a lot of the work I do is around materials and healthy and safe materials and creating spaces that support the health and well-being of building occupants. And I think that through the pandemic, clearly there's been a very strong focus on how spaces support the health and well-being of building occupants. So I think that that's another aspect. What materials are we using, and kind of the supply chain, I think is kind of another, again, it's kind of reinforced, I think, the benefits that a sector economy can have on the built environment.
Mm-hmm. Someone asks, is Arup's report available online?
It absolutely is. Yeah, you can find it on arup.com on the publication section. You can also find it on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website.
Thank you. And it's a fantastic report. We'll also send out the link to the report and to the several reports that Arup has done on circular economy and the built environment. We'll post those on the CarbonPositive website later in the month and make sure that an announcement of that goes out to our email list, which you can subscribe to at architecture2030/enews, architecture2030.org/enews. Are there any further questions? We can wait a minute to see if others come in. This has been a great conversation, and I recommend to everyone reading the report, diving into that research.
Thank you, Natasha. And as I said, if anyone wants to continue the conversation offline, please do feel free to reach out to me either by email or on LinkedIn.
Thank you. And you're getting a lot of thank yous into the Q&A box from our audience.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you all. So this session, the end of this session does conclude the session programming for the teach-in for North and South America. There are still a few more tool tutorials. So if you go to carbon-positive.org/agenda, you can find the links to see some demos of some great tools that help with reducing embodied carbon and operational carbon in buildings. Keep an eye out for the notice of recordings and published Q&A in the coming weeks. And we also encourage you to drop in to some sessions, if you like, for the September 17th and September 22nd teach-in events that we'll be hosting in different time zones. The 17th will be time zones aimed at European and African audience, and the 22nd will be time zones for Asia and Asia Pacific. So I'm assuming that most of you are in a time zone right now where this is a reasonable time to be on a Zoom. So some of those other sessions might be, early morning or night for you, but feel free to drop in. Some of the programming will be regionally specific, which could be interesting. We also encourage you, if you have colleagues or offices in those other global regions, to share the details with them and let them know to join. I will just share my conclusion slide real quick with the link to the agenda for anyone looking to join tool tutorials. And then we will sign off. Thank you everyone so much for joining, and thank you again, Emily.
Thank you very much.